Ogryns are one of the most loyal and brutal shock forces currently within wider use across the Asher Militarum. The Habsburg jawline brutes share a visage not unlike someone from Sussex in the UK. In fact, Games Workshop might have modeled it after the region, who knows, I don't. But with Darktide around the corner, I wanted to dive into the lore of the Ogryns, a divergent race of men that share an origin similar to Ratlings and the Squats of the older lore before they became the League of Votan. So in this video today, we'll be doing just that. Harkening back to a time when I covered 40k lore on the channel pretty extensively, we'll be discussing the origins, variations, war gear, and even some of the more noteworthy individuals of the Ogryns. You can quickly navigate to any part of the video that interests you the most by using the chapters in both the timeline and the description. And if you end up enjoying the video, please don't forget to like, comment, or subscribe. Each one of those things helps in varying ways to fight against the Witch, the Heretic, and the Xenos. But let's get started here on the lore of the Ogryns for Warhammer 40,000 Darktide. So before we talk about the current timeline, we need to throw time back to the good old days. Before the Imperium, man spanned the stars in a massive and powerful galactic empire that, depending on what timeline you're looking at, rivaled the Eldar Empire before its fall. And that's a pretty contentious point, as there's very little current lore, let alone actual documentation of the Dark Age of technology. Or so it was dubbed. Humanity had access to some real wild shit, like a ship, the Speranza, that could shoot black holes and turn time back so that you couldn't dodge them. Man stretched to expand their borders of understanding across all facets of life. The Men of Stone and subsequent Men of Iron were AI-powered robots that acted as both the military and labor force for humanity. This eventually led to the Cybernetic Revolt, when the Men of Iron became self-aware, traipsing around the galaxy asking people if they've seen Sarah Connor or her son. The resulting revolt was one of the many things that led to the collapse of humanity. Now, I've covered this all in its own video linked in the upper right, but let's get back on task here to discuss the Ogryns. Prior to the end of the Age of Technology and the beginning of the Age of Strife, humanity inhabited many different worlds across multiple environs, gravities, environmental hazards, and what have you. Humanity was able to defeat the obstacles of living on these planets by the use of their technology. But when the Age of Strife began and warp storms coupled with demonic incursions across the growing amount of psychers throughout the galaxy, humanity's worlds became isolated and cut off, and some portions subsisted in what are called pocket empires, small clusters of humanity that could band together. But most planets were isolated entirely from any form of communication or aid, the Sol system being a prime example. The planets with extremely high gravity, cold, and unforgiving landscapes led to less of a need to use technology at hand and more of a fight for survival on a world with little to offer in way of food and shelter. Abandoning technology more and more over time to live off of the meager providings of the land and across multiple generations, the humans of these worlds devolved. Or, rather, evolved, depending on whether or not you watch American NASCAR. Growing taller, their skin becoming thicker, and bodies more muscular all helped them traverse up and down the frigid hellscapes of their homeworlds. With gravity turned up to 11, this was like Vegeta training in a gravity chamber. Now, I think it's easy to make the distinction that they just became stupid, more in line with orcs than man when it comes to their critical thinking skills. But the lore makes it out to be more that, through a necessity to live, their minds became hyper-focused on survival. When you're fighting against blizzards and need to move constantly to find food, I think the philosophical debate of whether or not ants can tell time stops becoming important somewhere along the line. But when Old Night ended in M30 and these planets were rediscovered by the nascent Imperium, 5 millennia had passed, and the humans that inhabited these worlds were reclassified as abhumans, named Ogryns. This is a similar tale that can be told for both Ratlings and the former Squats. Now, standing 3 or so meters tall, complete with an overly brutish appearance like a landlord you owe money to, the Ogryns would go on to become some of the most loyal and important members of the Militarum Auxilia, the specialist attachment of the Imperial Guard geared towards mainly the abhumans discovered across the Great Crusade and subsequent time periods. Speaking in low Gothic, the Ogryns definitely can't be grand leaders of men, let alone be trusted to act as independent operators. Imagine that, like Black Hawk Down, but with Ogryns arfing at each other, which is a term I've just made up for the garbled way that they would communicate. Nay, instead, Ogryns are used as the proverbial meat shield, which they actually take to with both great expertise and delight. Their skin is supernaturally tough, making most small arms fire completely harmless to them. Sort of like, hunting a moose with a rubber band gun. And that's not really true, but it's a terrifying scenario that I want absolutely no part of. And in terms of general strength, Ogryns are on par, if not surpassing Space Marines, with their ability to fight orcs with their bare hands, as well as other feats that a guardsman would only dream of being able to accomplish. I mean, even looking at their profile in the board game, their strength and toughness is on par with the Custodian from the Adeptus Custodes. Now, when it comes to organization and leadership, after being indoctrinated into the beliefs of the Imperial Cult and the Imperial Creed, Ogryns believe that any command that comes from their superiors is being directly handed down to them by the Emperor himself. Now, theoretically, that's how the chain of command works, despite the fact that the Emperor isn't giving the orders directly, but the Ogryns believe that this is how it works in actuality. And on that notion of their rather limited mental capacity, Ogryns are typically unable to form complex thoughts, and more on that later. The result is a higher likelihood to be corrupted by chaos, and this is why we see so many in the ranks of the elites in Warhammer 40,000 Darktide. And typically they fall a bit more under Khorne's whims just because of the simplicity of beating a head in, but the game seems to be relatively chaos undivided until it deals with specific corrupted instances. Plague Beasts of Nurgle, Plague Ogryns, purifying Nurgle infestations on water sources, just the whole shebang. But back on track here, Ogryns serve as a defiant shield against the many enemies of the Imperium, doing so willingly and effectively. Let's move into a conversation about the different distinctions of Ogryns, because they typically fall into a sort of class system. Not like a societal class system, but more like a RPG class system depending on their intelligence, the era we're talking about, or their armament. The first distinction I want to talk about is the Bone'ead, which are more or less the sergeant or leaders of a squad of Ogryns. When an Ogryn exhibits a bit more intellectual depth than their peers, such as using blocks to spell their name, not drooling while eating peanut butter, and other traits of a fledgling genius, they are given a special cybernetic enhancement called the Nails. Okay, no way, that's the wrong lore, but seriously, it's really not that far off. It's a cerebral implant that helps to amplify and focus their intelligence. If I had said rage, it'd be the same damn thing as the World Eaters. This implant is called Biochemical Ogryn Neural Enhancement, or Bone, hence the name Bone'ead. The implant takes up half of their head and makes them look like Leslie Nielsen in the hit movie from 1993, Surf Ninjas. Kwanzaa, my dudes. With Bone installed, the Ogryn is able to keep focused during engagements, issuing commands throughout the tumult of battle, and leading his brethren quite well, actually. I know I said that the Ogryn is pretty incapable of being a leader of men, but the Bone'ead defies that and delivers, for all intents and purposes, a great military field commander with great instincts, brutal decisiveness, and a rigid stubbornness that has seen the field taken on many occasions by the critical movement of a coordinated Ogryn squad. Outside of just orders, the Bone'ead helps to keep the entire squad in line, resulting in far less disciplinary issues from Ogryn dim-wittedness. Overall, the Bone'eads keep the Ogryns in check, and they have zero reason to doubt or push back against their leader. Remember, they believe that any orders coming from on high are from the Emperor himself. So if the Bone'ead has been trusted to give them orders, then that's just good enough for them. The dark side to the bone implant is that it sometimes cannot fully bypass the innate savagery of the abhumans, and the enhanced coordination, dexterity, and lethality of a Bone'ead is amplified when they fall into that deep rage. The Imperium, never one to shrink in the face of an opportunity, has even enhanced the bone implant to further amplify this savagery with what is effectively a KGB trigger word to send the Bone'ead into a rampage against their foes. Moving to the more rank and file, we have Bullgryns, which are one of the most prolific uses of the brutes. Have an extra tank tread laying around, some carapace armor, slap the two together, make a shield, hand it to an Ogryn, and bam, you have a Bullgryn. These guys are basically a moving wall of Ogryn flesh. The specifically or specially fitted carapace armor, complete with tank treads, keep the abhumans in the fight for longer, coupled with their massive hunk of metal called a slap shield. The shields are designed to be linked together, creating a girthy phalanx that can move forward with very little out there able to slow them down. The name Bullgryn actually comes from another special distinction of Ogryn named Bulwark. Bulwarks are Ogryns that eschew any form of ranged weapons such as stubbers or ripper guns in exchange for the pure destruction of melee. Immovable and implacable, they will hold ground until the bitter end, fighting with any implement they can find, even sometimes the dead at their feet. Mauls, knuckle dusters, sharpened sheet metal with a grip that, takes on the rough look of a knife, anything that works in the hands of a bulwark. Now, if you take the name bulwark and Ogryn, combine them together, you get Bullgryn, which is a bulwark with a ton of armor on them. Outside of the armor and shield, the Bullgryn is either equipped with a massive power maul to billy club their way to the objective like a tyrannical riot squad, or a grenadier gauntlet. This, of course, is an arm-mounted grenade launcher that gives the shield wall an even more devastating effect as it hurls towards the enemy. Now, in the current iteration of 9th edition, the Astra Militarum book only has access to the Bullgryn, the Ogryn bodyguards, which are simply Bullgryns honor-bound to an individual, and the generic Ogryns with Ripper guns. In earlier editions, you could equip your Ogryns with heavy stubbers, something we see in Darktide with your player character or the Reaper elites holding down a firing lane and suppressing you endlessly. Even some of the earliest editions had them using heavy bolters, autoguns, all sorts of heavy weapons, treating the brutes like a moving weapons platform. Now, since this is more of an older throwback in the lore, I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but it's worth noting that at one point, Ogryns were used for far more than just getting up close and personal. Their simple minds seem to be best suited to a singular focus, and gun luggers focus on the wicked delight of spraying a room with raking shots of heavy stubber fire while huffing a cigar and throwing a thumbs up at the camera. And we've talked about all of the Ogryns you'd witness in the Astra Militarum now, in the current timeline at least. But in the way back times when Horus wasn't corrupted by that asshole Erebus, Ogryns had a substantial role in the Great Crusade. Ogryn Charonites, or maybe it's Charonites, I'm not really sure, were equipped with a sort of rudimentary power armor. Or maybe again, it was just simply heavy metal armor. It's Ogryns, who knows. And in their fists were devastating melee weapons consisting of claws, grinders, something that looks like mining equipment, just a horrifying array. The Ogryns were further enhanced by cybernetics and other modifications, increasing their innate rage, while the Charonite claws amplified their strength. The Charonites were in wide use by the Solar Auxilia, which was the Saturnine Ordo that had joined the Imperium during the earliest stage of the Great Crusade. The Solar Auxilia would form an elite infantrymen second to the Astartes, specializing in void warfare and other specialist missions. Ship-to-ship combat would become a specialty of the Charonites, allowing them to utilize their brutality in confined spaces. And it's unknown whether or not the Charonites had been completely decommissioned after the Crusade or are hidden from the wider Imperium in the modern day. But having access to Charonite claws in Darktide would be absolutely testicularly burstingly amazing. And a relatively new distinction to join the band is the Ogryn that has been both modified and purposed solely for manual labor. Augmetics and whole limbs replaced with tools meant to increase labor output, the Ogryn Slaves make up a big part of the House of Chains supplement for Necromunda. Power fists, huge wrenches, all of this and more make up the armament of the Jotun H-grade Servitor Ogryns, which is just an awfully complex name for a rather limited intellectual individual. There isn't a ton here, and it's kind of expanded upon more in the House of Chains and the House of Blade supplements, but I did want to bring these up in the video because Power Fists on Darktide, or in Darktide, is something I want to see on a lot of different levels. And our second to last distinction is not Imperial at all. In fact, it's quite heretical. I guess so was the last one, actually. But the Ogryn Brute is the Ogryn that has fallen to the fancies of chaos, either by being corrupted or just by simply being offered puppies in an unmarked white van. Who knows with these guys? Ogryn Brutes have all manner of modifications, mutations, and other enhancements that the Imperium wouldn't even think of getting near. This makes for some truly destructive abominations on the battlefield. The Ogryn Berserker, a distinction of the Brute, is an Ogryn that has fallen deeply into the supple bosom of Khorne, drinking deep the blood rage that already intrinsically fills the abhumans. Now, that's not to say that they are just painted red and yell about a skull throne. Nay, they are augmented out the ass with tons of chemicals and even more cybernetic implants. The Ogryn is effectively lobotomized, then fed a constant cocktail of chemicals that augment their strength, deaden their nerves to wounds, allowing them to fight on through almost any pain, and increase their bloodlust tenfold. Large tubes on their back pump this stuff into the Ogryn at their master's whims, turning them into a nigh unstoppable wrecking ball. They are also given a special drug called Slot, which is just the word slaughter without the ER at the end. The flesh terrors and world eaters used to huff this stuff like paint out of a paper bag in a Walmart parking lot. Naturally, it increases aggression even further, making the Ogryn Berserker a force to be reckoned with. The mutants of Darktide seem to be kind of modeled after these guys, but I could be totally wrong on that. Either way, the Vraxian traitor militia utilized the Berserkers during the famous siege of Vrax to turn the tide on multiple occasions. And the other Chaos Ogryn we all know about is the Plague Ogryn, again coming to us from the siege of Vrax on Vrax Prime, thanks to a warband of Chaos Marines dedicated to Nurgle the Tainted. And combining the already augmented physiology of the Ogryn Slaves with the gifts of Nurgle and a splash of the dark arts resulted in the creation of Plague Ogryns. Alongside their maniacal Berserker Ogryn brethren, the siege was a bloody ordeal for all involved. The last type of Ogryn I want to talk about is another newcomer, and it is the Awakened Ogryn. There are two parts of this now. They originally have their origins in Necromunda thanks to a rogue psyker named Urson Graves. Urson, down in High Prime in a lovely place called Heretic's Hold, was experimenting with creating psykers rather than having them be a kind of random happen chance mutation. Utilizing a drug known as Gast, he administered it to a slew of test subjects, but all of them resulted in a lot of spontaneous combustion from warp energy that they were just not able to control. In comes the next 5 test subjects, Ogryns. Of the 5, one survived the procedure, earning the nickname the Thinker. Now, it's not conclusive as to whether or not these test subjects were just any old Ogryns or if they were the ones with advanced cognitive abilities like the Boneheads, or what the Boneheads eventually become. The result is like an air guitar riff that rocks like 10,000 fucking jet fighters. They can augment their own bodies, wreathe themselves in flame, charge up their weapons not unlike the Psyker and Darktide, all sorts of these badass abilities coupled with their innate durability and strength. Holy hot covered shit. I'd love to see Awakened Ogryns as a subclass for the game in the future to just completely turn the archetype on its head. Now, the other part to this, and outside of Necromunda, after Abaddon destroyed Cadia and a tumult of other events we know to be the current landscape of the 8th and 9th editions, Ogryn Psykers have started spontaneously appearing throughout the galaxy. Cassia, a female Ogryn in a penal legion, went on to learn more about her psychic powers from a space wolf rune priest, Orm Hendrickson. In that time, she then kind of taught herself to read and write, as well as becoming well-versed in the ordobiologist. So the sky's the limit with the future potential of the Awakened Ogryn in both Warhammer, the tabletop, and Darktide. And at that, it brings our video here to a close. Ogryns are one of the oldest units and models in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, being around since the Rogue Trader days and staying true to their roots all through their many, many brutish iterations over the years. And it's exciting to see them holding a real pivotal and central role here in Warhammer 40,000 Darktide, which launches today. And it's even more exhilarating to see where the game might possibly go with subclass combinations for these guys. I'd love to hear what you guys think, that what we could possibly see in the Ogryn in the months and years to come. Fat Shark had mentioned that they plan to roll out a new subclass every quarter. We'll see if they stick to that timeline, but it does deliver a lot of great potential for our favorite big boys. I didn't go into Nork Dog, who I think I'll save for his own video, so let me know in the comment section below if you'd like to see a Nork Dog video, the famous, I guess you could call him a famous Bullgryn, who becomes the bodyguard of a Catachan colonel. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one, and take care.